A second. So we are still in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 10. And really, this is kind of our fourth or fifth attempt to have this conversation. But at the same time, this will be like the final complete conversation on the millennium and all that good stuff. And I said to these people before, those are in the Zoom study, before we got started, if you get lost, it'll be okay. We'll try to come up out of the muck and mire in our next meeting that we can have. We're gonna take 3 or 4 weeks off, just so you know. But feel free to ask questions and comment. Obviously, if you're on Facebook Live, send me a note and I can address it in the next meeting. I'm not looking at the Facebook feed, so I can't look at your questions today live, but feel free to send me an email or send me a messenger with your questions. We'll be happy to address those also. And let me open with a word of prayer and we'll get ourselves rolling. So thank you, Father, for this day. Thank you for your work and for all that you're doing in our lives. We pray that you'll be with those who are traveling and those who are not well and who are not with us. And we just ask your mercy upon them. Bless them in all things. Be glorified now in our conversation. Give us wisdom and understanding. Give us humility to not only hear and understand, especially from your Holy Spirit, but also so that we might be transformed in our hearts and in our minds from what we hear and what we learn. We thank you now for these things, and we ask your blessings upon this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so I'm going to do some review. And again, just kind of remind ourselves where we're at. Everybody see the notes, understanding Armageddon and the millennium, and then it says caution. You guys all see that? Yep. Does anybody need it? We're good? Okay, very good. All right, caution. At the end of the day, speculating about the future events and especially the when of these events is not wise. And I put a couple notes. The future should give us comfort and hope. The future can remind us of what we are persevering for. And the future also, well, the understanding of the new creation should impact our theology today and our practice for today, such as the role of women in the church and creation care and a lot of other things also, as well, of course, as the mission of God's people and all things like that. Beyond that, the future is just a future and has little impact on living like Jesus today. And what I mean by that is, so I guess it's fair to say I've done a little bit of study in this topic, right? In the book of Revelation and the end times and related topics. And I don't think I know what the end is going to be like. I just don't think the Bible's answering that question. I think the biblical writers, whether it's Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew or Mark, and Jesus speaking to his disciples, and Mark writing to his people in his churches, or whether it's Paul writing to the churches in Thessalonica and things of that nature, or whether it's John writing the book of Revelation to the 7 churches of Asia. I don't think they were trying to answer the questions about the end. I think they gave some speculations about the end, and we have some answers like Jesus is going to come back. But I don't think we have details. Is it going to get really, really bad before the end? Well, maybe, but maybe not. And I think if we say, oh, it's going to get really, really, really bad before the end, then one of the things that happens with that is we just stop trying. And I think that's actually bad. So even if it is going to get really, really bad before the end, and I'm not sure that it is or it isn't, we shouldn't hold to that theology that says it is because, or so tightly that it affects the way we live today. In the sense of, I'm not going to try to overcome poverty. I'm not going to try to overcome the immigration problems. I'm not going to try to overcome war and violence. I'm not going to try to overcome those things because it's going to happen and there's nothing we can do about it. And when Jesus comes back, it'll all get better. I think that's actually very dangerous theology. So, okay, if you have a question, let me know. All right, here we go. Now, I'm going to skip the next part about the chronological reading. I'm going to come back to it in a second. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Let's go to Revelation chapter 20, and let's read verses 1 through 10. And I know we read them before. So Revelation 20, verses 1 through 10. And then we'll ask the question, then we'll go back to the notes above. So Revelation 20, 1 through 10. If somebody wants to read, please feel free to do so.
I got it.
Thank you, sir.
1,000 years. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for a few thousand years, and threw him into the pit and locked and sealed it over him, so that he would deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be let out for a little while. When I saw thrones and those seated on them were given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their testimony to Jesus and for the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him 1,000 years. Satan's doom. When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for battle. They are as numerous as the sands of the sea. They marched up over the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, one of the problems that we have is that I think we're stepping into an insider's conversation. You know, when you step into a conversation that two people are having and you walk in the middle of it, and you're trying to figure out what the conversations, what they've been saying beforehand, because they're in the middle of a conversation now, and obviously there's been 20 minutes of dialogue beforehand, or like listening to a phone conversation and go, not only who is my wife talking to, but what are they saying and what is my wife saying? You know, and you can usually tell by the tone of voice and kind of the response. Oh, she's speaking to her sister. Oh, she's speaking to so and so. All right. I think that's what's going on, but the problem is we don't know that for sure. And if we are stepping into an insider conversation, John's speaking to people in his churches, the 7 churches, and they already know what he's talking about. That's what I mean by an insider conversation. They're already on the inside. Like, for example, what is the first resurrection? Doesn't tell us. What is the second death? Doesn't tell us. I think that indicates that they already know. Otherwise, John would have laid it out what the second death was. He would have laid it out what the first resurrection is, but he doesn't. And he doesn't say it anywhere else. So I think that the word first resurrection, or the words first resurrection, only occurs here in the book of Revelation. So you can't go to another passage to appeal to it. So that's the first problem that I think is there. That means that we're going to have to speculate a little bit as to what that insider conversation is. What were they saying? And therefore, how was John responding to in light of what they were saying? And because of that, we have to be careful. So I'm going to give you what I think was going on, which I did a little bit last time we were together. Here's what I think is going on, and here's why I think this is what's going on. But at the end of the day, we can't really prove it. We can't really be absolutely certain. Okay, here's the deal. We talked about the war in Revelation chapter 20, verse 8, several times now. And the language of Revelation 20, verse 8, Satan will be released from his prison, go out to the nations that are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. And the number there are like the sand of the sea. Okay. The phrase to gather them together for the war is verbatim the same as in chapter 16. So if you want to turn there for a second, you can. It's just a quick review. And I didn't do an extensive review tonight. So here we go. Chapter 16. Verse 14, verse 30. Well, somebody want to read verses 13 and 14? Revelation 16, 13, and 14.
I can.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs, for they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings of the entire world, to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty.
All right, there you go. To gather them together for the war. And the phrase to gather them together for the war is identical with the phrase in chapter 20, verse 8. The same phrase, which is slight variation, but the same words, even though it's a little different, occurs in chapter 19, verse 19. So chapter 19, verse 19. Somebody want to read 19:19? Anybody got it?
I got it.
Thanks, Rob.
So 19:19. And I saw the beasts and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army.
Okay, so we have the same war being described 3 times, and that's going to be the key thing that I'm going to discuss as we move on through the passage. So if you skip down in the notes a little bit, it says, I skipped the paragraph that says the argument for a chronological reading. Skip that one for a second. The next thing says Armageddon. And my note says there's little doubt that the war in 20 verses 7 through 10, which is 20 verse 8, is the same war that was in 1612 through 16 that we read the verses 13 and 14. And the same war that was in 1917 through 21, which we read chapter 19, verse 19. It's the same war. Okay, so now let's go back up. Okay, let me remind ourselves of the conversation that we're having. The question is when does this millennium happen? What we know about the millennium is two things. Well, we know, all right, the word millennium means 1,000 years, and we're going to look at a couple Old Testament verses again to remind ourselves. It means 1,000 years, and what we know in this passage, chapter 20, is that Satan's bound for the 1,000 years, and that the souls under the altar who were slain reign for 1,000 years. That's what we know of the 1,000 years. And the question is when does this 1,000 years occur? That's the question. And there are three views that we talked about very briefly, I think 2 weeks ago, but I'm only going to talk about two of them. And then maybe at the end, we can discuss the third one if we want. And the third one we don't need to talk about because I don't think anybody here holds to that view. And it's not very popular today. So let's just kind of push it to the side for a second. All right. The popular view. And the popular view is held to by a lot of really good scholars. So don't misunderstand me. It's the popular view, but it's held to by a lot of really good scholars. But it's also held to by the Hal Lindsays and the Lake Great Planet Earth and the end of the world and Armageddon. And so that camp, they all hold what's called pre-millennialism. Just the word millennium with the word pre before it. And what the pre means is that Jesus returns before the millennium. That's what the pre and the millennial means. Jesus, and that's the question. When does Jesus return with regard to the millennium? Premillennialism says Jesus returns before the millennium. And their number one argument, and it's a good argument, so I'm not going to deny that at all, is that Jesus returns in chapter 19 of the book of Revelation, and the millennium is described in chapter 20 in the book of Revelation. So it's chronology. I'll say it again. The number one argument is chronology, that the book of Revelation is telling us something in chronological order, maybe not all of it, but chapter 19 occurs before chapter 20, and 19 is the return of Jesus, and 20 is the millennium. So clearly the binding of Satan happens after Jesus returns. He's thrown into a pit for 1,000 years, and then they have kind of a whole scheme that comes, and then Christ reigns from heaven there. Okay, that's one major view. The second major view, which is actually not well named, is called just the letter A in front of the word millennium. Millennialism. Okay, and the letter A means like no, or like an theist means no God. Theos for God and for no. But they don't actually believe in no millennium. What they believe is that the millennium is presently occurring now. And so they believe that there's like no literal millennium where Jesus actually reigns from Jerusalem on the earth. But that's not even, like, oh, you don't believe in a literal millennium. Like, yes, I do. I just don't believe it in the same way that you do. So don't worry about the name millennialism, like what it means, but note that it means that the millennium occurs now and Jesus returns at the end of the millennium. Okay, right, now let's go to Isaiah. And I know we read Isaiah 11 and Isaiah 65 last time. So let's go to Isaiah 60 this time. Isaiah chapter 60, or Isaiah as it's properly called by our British friends. And it is, by the way, Isaiah. Us Americans have Americanized it incorrectly. It's Isaiah. But I ain't gonna change the way I talk. Ain't now, ain't never, and ain't not gonna happen in the future, whatever that might mean. All right, so here we go, Isaiah 60. I'm gonna kind of skim through the passage, if that's okay. Isaiah 60, verse 1. Arise and shine, for your light has come, for the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Okay, stop. From a New Testament perspective, what is Isaiah talking about? We're cheating because we're going straight to the New Testament. We're not going to Isaiah right now. We're going to the New Testament. What would Paul say? What would Matthew say that verse is about? There's only three possible answers. There's three possible answers, and one of them is correct. Well, John, you're kind of right. There's God,
Jesus.
That's A. There's Jesus, that's B. And there's love, that's C. Those are the three options. Anna is choosing option B, Jesus, right? Yeah, it's and John, you could say it's the resurrection, right? Because that actually is quoted. Isaiah 60 verse 1 is actually quoted in one of the resurrection passages. Arise, your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. It's Jesus. First John chapter 1, it's verses 1 through 4. So I don't know what one of the verses says. We beheld his glory. Actually, I'm sorry. John chapter 1, verse 14 says, we beheld his glory. There you go. The glory of the Lord has risen upon you. All right, verse 2. For behold, darkness will cover the earth, and deep darkness the peoples, but the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will appear upon you. Nations will come to your light, and the kings of the earth will bring to the brightness of your rising. The kings of the earth. That's talking about, what would Matthew say the kings of the earth in verse 3 refers to? Or what does Matthew say the kings of the earth refers to? We three kings of all. Don't make me sing anymore. All right. All right. Matthew calls them magi. But in our songs, we call them kings. Why do we call them kings? Because Isaiah called them kings. The kings will come, right, to your rising. Nations will come to your light. Where did the light lead them to? It led them to Jerusalem. But then after they went to Jerusalem and spoke to Herod and they couldn't find the baby there, then what happened? The light led them to Jesus. This is what's going on. Isaiah 60, it's about Jesus. All right, so let's see. Your sons will come from afar, verse 4. The wealth of verse 5, the wealth of the nations will come to you. Verse 5, let me skip down here a little bit. Verse 10. Foreigners will build up your walls. Verse 11. Your gates will be open continually. They will not be closed day or night, so that men may bring to you the wealth of the nations. Okay, we haven't read that far, but that's Revelation 22. The gates will never, it says in the nighttime, it says the gates will never be closed, because in the nighttime, well, there'll be no night there. And because there'll be no night, its gates will never be closed. That's the end of chapter 21 in the book of Revelation, maybe verse 24, 25, there. Okay, so here we go. So it's describing what we might want to call the millennium, or we might want to call we'll call it the new creation, because Isaiah 60 is beginning, leading us to Isaiah 65. So let's go to Isaiah 65 that we looked at last time, unless you have any questions. Isaiah 65 now. All right, and I know we read this last time, so I'll just kind of skim through it again. Verse 17, behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth. Well, that's Revelation 21, verse 1, right? I mean, that Revelation 21, verse 1 says, at the beginning of the new creation of the new Jerusalem, I create a new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered or come to mind. And verse 18, in the middle of it, it says, I create Jerusalem for rejoicing. All right. Verse 20, no longer will there be an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who doesn't live out his days. For the youth will die at 100, and the one who does not reach the age of 100 will be thought accursed. And we looked at this last time, but they'll build houses and inhabit them, meaning it won't be given to the Babylonians who conquer them. They'll plant vineyards and eat their own fruit, which means they won't plant vineyards and the Babylonians come and take their fruit away from them. All right, verse 20, let's see, 3. They will not labor in vain or bear children for calamity, for they are the offspring of those blessed by the Lord and the descendants with them. And will also come to pass before they call, I will answer. And while they're still speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb will graze together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox, and dust will be the serpent's food. They will do neither evil or harm in all my holy mountains, says the Lord. Okay. Now, a very common argument of premillennialism, the popular view that many scholars hold to as well, that says Jesus returns in chapter 19 of Revelation, and then Satan's bound, and then 1,000 years. So Jesus reigns on the earth for 1,000 years. They will commonly read Isaiah 65 and say that's what's being described. And it makes sense, right? Because even though Revelation 21 quotes Isaiah 65, for the new creation, it says people are going to die. And there's not going to be any death in the new creation. And it says, if you die, young, you'll be thought accursed. And you don't have to worry about, foreign armies. Well, there are no foreign armies in the new creation. So the idea is, this is describing the millennial reign of Jesus. Oh, I skipped too far. This is describing the millennial reign of Jesus, where he reigns for 1,000 years from Jerusalem. So Jesus comes back, physically reigns from Jerusalem. And again, many premillennialists will argue Jerusalem means Jerusalem. And when it says Jerusalem, it means Jerusalem. And there's many promises about Jerusalem being restored. And that must mean the physical city of Jerusalem where Jesus actually reigns from. That's a common premillennial viewpoint. That's fine. Okay. So are we good with that so far? All right, let's go back to the notes. And again, and welcome Dara and a few of the others that have joined us. And the warning goes out that we're going to go deep and you may get lost, and that's okay, because if we do get lost, it'll be all right. We'll just move on in the following week. So hopefully we'll see how well we can do. All right,
Hey,
so let's
Rob.
go. Yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
I got a question, and pardon
Please.
me, because it's more trivia than anything.
That's
But
all right.
in Jerusalem currently at the temple, the Lion's Gate is all sealed off, and I think that's in reference to what we were reading here earlier about the gates will always be open. Who did that and why? I mean, what was the thinking?
I have heard the answer to that. I was sitting on the Mount of Olives when we discussed this question. And I want to say, I don't remember the answer is what I'm going to say. I'll have to look it up. But I'm wanting to say, actually, I think it might have been either after the Babylonian invasion or after the rebuilding of the wall at the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, that they sealed that gate up so that the Jews from the north, the Samaritans, couldn't come in and invade. But I really honestly don't remember, and I don't recall. So,
Okay.
all right, very good. Okay, here we go. So back on the notes on understanding Armageddon and the Millennium, the second paragraph down, I think it's in bold print, at least it is in my notes. I hope it is in yours. And it says, trying to find your notes. And it says, yeah, the argument for a chronological reading of the book of Revelation, in fact, becomes a double-edged sword. Okay, the argument is Revelation 19 says Jesus returns. Revelation 20 says Satan is bound. Therefore, Jesus returns first, then Satan is bound. And the problem with that is it doesn't actually work. And here's the reason why. And if you get lost, I'm sorry, but we'll see. We can just ask questions if you need to. After all, the war, this is the note, which Satan wages upon his release from the abyss in chapter 20, verse 8, most certainly corresponds to the war in chapter 16 and the war in chapter 19. It's the same war. That's what we just discussed. It's the exact same war in chapter 16, chapter 19, verses 17 through 21, and in chapter 20, verses 7, 8, 9, and 10. So if this is so, and as if we're going to argue for chronology, then the demand for chronological reading faces a conundrum, right? In English, a conundrum is like you got a problem that you really can't solve. Right? After all, the war in 1612 and 1917 occurs before the millennium. Yet the war in chapter 20, verse 8 occurs after the millennium. So if it's the same war and we're arguing chronology, and we have the war in 16 before the millennium in 20, we have the war in 19 before the millennium in 20, therefore the war happens before the millennium. But the millennium happens before the war in chapter 20, verses 7 through 10. So which one is it? Now, of course, the answer to that from a premillennialist is it's not the same war. That's their answer. The problem with that is there's no way you can argue that, in my opinion, from the book of Revelation. And this is what I think I'm hoping that my commentary is going to establish as kind of a new dictum that says John consistently links passages. And in my commentary, I probably show 30, 40 examples of this. I don't remember exactly how many, where he links passages by using the same words or same terms. And the fact that we have a verbatim, gather them together for the war in 16 verse 14 and 20 verse 8, it's the same war. There's no way that you can argue the way John's written this document that they're not the same war. But that's what you have to argue, is that it's not the same war. And again, right, it is what it is. They're just going to, someone who's a premillennialist will just deny my argument, and that's okay. That's fine. Okay, so here we go. Let's go to the fill in the blanks. Oops. Oh, I've got your notes in front of me. And I don't have when I have your notes, I don't have to fill in the blank. I have to make sure I know what the answer is. So here we go. The next paragraph then says this. These three passages recount the same war that is clearly evident from the repetition of the phrase together for the war 16, 16, 19, 19, 20 verse 8. All right, so the point is you just can't argue chronology. Doesn't mean that premillennialism is wrong. You just can't argue chronology. Next paragraph. In addition, the fact that the verb to gather, and that's the fill in the blank, to gather, occurs only 5 times in the book of Revelation, and I listed the 5 occurrences, and all 5 occurrences are in these 3 passages. there's no question that the verb to gather is being used to link these three passages. It only occurs in 16:12 through 16, 19:17 through 20, and in 20 verses 7 through 10. And the verses, if you're listening online or whatever, are 16:14 and 16:16, 19:17 and 19:19, and 20 verse 8. That's the 5 times and the only 5 times the verb to gather occurs in the book of Revelation. And John constantly links passages by repeating words. And the fact that he restricts the verb to gather to these 3 passages says it's the same war. Okay, so here we go. Next statement down. It says also that the war which Satan wages upon his release in chapter 20, verse 7, is waged by the nations in the 4 corners. This is I'm gonna clarify this more as we go. So I'm gonna go over this fast, but this will come up in the notes again below. So don't worry. Right, so we have the 3 bullet points are the 3 passages: 20 verse 8, 16:14, and 19:19. The war which Satan wages is waged by, in chapter 20 verse 8, it's waged by the nations that are in the 4 corners of the earth. In 16 verse 14, it's waged by the kings of the inhabited world, which is the same. Because the kings of the inhabited world means all the kings of all the inhabited world. I mean, that's just what the phrase the inhabited world means in the book of Revelation. In 19:19, it says it's waged by the kings of the earth and their armies. It's the same war. All 3 wars are waged by who? The kings or the nations that are in the 4 corners of the earth. So there's another way that we link it. Okay. Tell me if I'm going too fast or if you have any questions. We good? Okay, next paragraph. It says each of the accounts of the war is also linked. There's another reason why these 3 passages are all linked. By the explicit indication that the enemies of Christ and the people of God are the dragon, the beast, and or the false prophet. These 3 passages are all linked by repetition of one of these 3 creatures. In chapter 16, verses 12 through 16, all 3 of them are mentioned. Remember, we just read the verse. I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits that look like frogs. Okay. All 3 are mentioned in chapter, and so that's the fill in the blank, by the way. The fill in the blank is all 3 are mentioned as instigators of the war. And the 3 are the beast, or Satan, the beast, and the false prophet. And the Satan is also sometimes called the dragon in these passages. In chapter 19, verses 17 through 21, the beast and the false prophet, only those 2, but that's the 2 fill in the blanks, the beast and the false prophet, they wage war against Christ. Now you can argue, well, it can't be the same war then, because in chapter 16, all 3 of them wage war. And in chapter 19, only 2 are mentioned. Well, I'll explain that in a minute. In chapter 20, verses 1 through 3 and 7 through 10, the dragon, and that's the fill in the blank, or Satan, you can fill in the blank with either one or both. The dragon or Satan and the nations are explicitly mentioned. So you have all 3 in chapter 16, 2 of the 3 in chapter 19, and then the 3rd one in chapter 20. Okay, so what's going on? All right, so the next part is I'm going to explain why the latter 2 passages only refer to Satan and the beast. Why the 19 passage refers to the beast and the false prophet, and why the chapter 20 passage refers to Satan, and why the 16 passage refers to all 3. That's what I'm going to do in the next couple paragraphs. Okay, and we'll move on after this. Here we go. So why then? What's the role of each of these 3 accounts? Then is the question I'm asking. And the answer is this: the famed Armageddon passage, the 16:12 through 16, and the account of the 6th bowl serves as the preliminary account. That's the fill in the blank. The preliminary account. This is the one that sets the stage. All the other ones refer back to this one. This is the first time it's referred to. Here we go. This is the war, and it's the preliminary account, or the first account of what may be described as the final phase of the eschatological or end times war. Okay. In this account, we learn that the war is the work of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. And they deceive the nations or the kings of the whole world. And so that they wage war. And it's also, although it's not stated in this account, against whom the war is waged, the fact that verse 15, which if you remember, it's been a number of weeks now since we did this. In verse 15, there's a parenthetical warning. Oh, blessed are those who stay awake and keep their clothes with them. You're describing Armageddon in 16, 12, 13, 14, and in verse 16, but in verse 15, it's like, oh, by the way, parenthetically, blessed are those who stay awake and keep their clothes with them. Like the parenthetical warning to the church, or the people of God, indicates the war is against them. It doesn't state that though, but it certainly indicates that. That's why we have this parenthetical statement. And in most translations, English translations at least, put verse 15 in parentheses. Okay, so that's the first passage. The second passage, in chapter 19, verses 17 through 21. In this passage, John attributes the war to the work of the beast and the false prophet. That's the two fill in the blanks again from above. Although Satan is not mentioned. All right, so it attributes the war to the beast and the false prophet, but Satan's not mentioned. But as was the case, tell me if I'm going too fast. As was the case in the Armageddon passage, it says the beast and the false prophet wage war by deceiving the nations. So again, we have the theme of deception. We just don't have Satan here. And it specifically says the kings of the earth and their armies. This time, John says that the war is against Christ and the people of God. And we thought it was because in chapter 16, it said, blessed are those who stay awake and keep their garments with them. So we thought the war was against God's people, and now we know for sure that it is. So the fill in the blank is Christ and the people of God, the two fill in the blanks. It's Christ and the people of God. And then the next sentence says this, and there's one more fill in the blank. It says, this account also presents the ultimate outcome, or the final outcome, and the word outcome is the fill in the blank, of the beast and the false prophet. These two were thrown alive in the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. The reason why, and I'll say it again, do I need to repeat any fill in the blanks? That paragraph was beast and false prophet, Christ and people of God, and then outcome. The reason why Satan's not mentioned in this passage is because this passage is about the final judgment of the beast and the false prophet. That's why Satan's not mentioned. They're thrown in the lake of fire. Remember, we have three passages that all end in, they were thrown in the lake of fire. This is the first one, and it's the beast and the false prophet. The next passage, tell me if I need to stop or slow down, is chapter 20, verses 7 through 10. And John attributes the war to the work of the dragon. Right? As with the previous accounts, Satan wages war by deception. That's the fill in the blank, by deception. Same thing in all the passages. It's deception. In addition, this account places an emphasis on the fact that the war is waged against the people of God, wherever they may be. It says Satan gathered to and surrounded the camp of the saints in the holy city.
Rob,
Yes, John.
did I miss a whole section there?
I'm not sure.
You went from outcome, the fill in the blank outcome.
Okay, so we're in the next paragraph after that.
And mine shows 19, 17 through 21.
That was where outcome was.
Okay.
Right. And then, so the fill in the blank for was outcome. So the fill in the blank for 19, 17 through 21, there's five fill in the blanks. So it was beast and false prophet. Do you have that, John?
Yeah, but
Christ and people of God, and then outcome.
Oh.
And then
Okay.
in 20 verses 7 through 10, there's only one
Okay.
fill in the blank, and it's deception.
Okay.
Yeah. So okay,
Sorry.
I hope that works. So all right, here we go. The middle of that paragraph under 27 through 10. This third account, as it was in 1917 through 20, relays the final outcome. This time, it's for the dragon. And it says in verse 10, the devil, the one who deceives them, was thrown in the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet are also. So the reason why the beast and false prophet are not mentioned in 20 verse 10 is because they were judged in 1917 through 21. And the reason why this dragon is not mentioned in 1917 through 21 is because he's judged in 20 verses 1 through 10. That's all. Okay. So here we go. So now, next paragraph. In response, I would contend that John's primary concerns are literary. And that's the fill in the blank. They're literary. He's not trying to give us history. He's not trying to tell us what the way it's actually going to transpire. He's telling us, and you can tell because he's carving this and crafting this by repeating terms and languages and putting everything together. From a literary standpoint, the repeated descriptions of the war clearly build off one another. So this is just all repeat from what we just said. The first account in 16:13 through 16 says, the foundation for understanding the war. In this account, there's no explicit mention as to whom the war is waged against, nor the outcome of the war. The second and the third accounts, 19:17 through 21 and 20 verses 7 through 10, explicitly declare that the war is waged against Christ and the people of God. These latter two accounts also set forth the outcome of the war. Even here, John's literary concerns are first and foremost. This is evident in that the second account emphasizes that the war is against Christ and his army, that the beast and false prophet are destroyed in the lake of fire. And the third account says the war is waged against the people of God, wherever they may be located. And the devil, that is the dragon or Satan, is destroyed in the lake of fire. Okay, so now we're on the topic of the millennium. Okay, so what I've done is, I hope, and I hope I haven't lost you, is let's look at the text. Now, let me stop here, also mention this, and I think I mentioned this before. This is the only passage in the entire Bible that refers to a millennium, which means tread lightly, because we can't compare this to any other passage. Now, you might argue, and somebody else might argue, that Isaiah 65 is describing the millennium. That's fine. Isaiah 65 doesn't say it's going to be 1,000 years, though. So are we supposed to connect these two passages or not? Maybe, maybe not. And that's a problem. And it really is a problem. I think that's another indication that we're in the middle of an insider conversation. John's having a conversation with the 7 churches, and he's using insider language. And what I mean by insider language is that, for some reason, I'm getting a thumb. You guys see that? I think it's because my hand was up, right, Anna? Because I wasn't touching anything on my keyboard, but I'm all of a sudden I'm getting some like thumbs up on the emoji there on the screen.
It's a
Anyways,
sign.
it's a sign. There you go. You're right on, Rob. That was God saying I was right on, because God touched the screen because I didn't do it. So anyways, I have a little note here. It says it recognizes hand gestures. It's like, I'm Italian. What do you want me to do? You know, Mama, me. I got to speak with my hands because that's what we do. So anyways, but I'm British Italian, by the way. So don't worry too much, Helen. 3/4 British, 1/4 Italian. So anyways, but and now I tell you
Forget about it.
Yeah, there you go. Forget about it. So Vinny and I have a lot of good conversations because Vinny's like full Italian, right? Vinny and Angela. We have a lot of good conversations. We get lost. Now, here's the point. The insider conversation is, and what I mean by that language is, John's using words that they know what he's talking about, but we don't. That's what insider language is. Insider language is, if you're not on the inside, you don't know what they're talking about. So now we're on the outside jumping in, and he's talking about 1,000 years as if they know what he's talking about, because it's never been described anywhere else as 1,000 years. So, and that's what I'm about to explain. Okay, so here we go. The millennium. And again, if you hold to a different view than I do, great. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. I think we're both going to be in the eternal New Jerusalem together. I'm not sure about you. I am about myself, but you probably will be there. So we'll just get along and like each other in the meantime, because we're gonna have to live together for 1,000 years, forever. So here we go. We begin by noting that John interrupts. That's the first fill in the blank. So under millennium, it says, we begin by noticing that John interrupts the account of the destruction of Satan. And the word interrupts is the fill in the blank, with the account of the victorious people of God. And that's why we read verses 1 through 10 again. Remember we discussed that last time? It's describing Satan being thrown in the lake of fire. In the previous passage, the beast and the false prophet were thrown in the lake of fire. In this passage, Satan's thrown in the lake of fire. In the next passage, verses 11 through 15 of chapter 20, death and Hades will be thrown in the lake of fire. But he doesn't just simply say, oh, guess what? Jesus comes back, Satan's thrown in the lake of fire. He starts off by saying, well, Satan's bound for 1,000 years. And then he interrupts that 1,000 years by saying, oh, and guess what? I saw thrones and they sat upon them. And judgment was given to them. And this is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death won't hurt them. You're like, what are you talking about? Who are these people and why are you interrupting the conversation? I think that's really important, because the people to whom he's talking about are the people to whom he was writing. Saying, if you die, don't worry about it. Look what happens to you. You're resurrected and you reign with Christ for 1,000 years. I think that's what's going on. Okay. All right, here we go. So notice the next paragraph says, the tab in says this, or the bullet point. Notice that chapter 20, verse 7 resumes. That's the fill in the blank. Resumes the narrative that was left off in chapter 20, verse 3. And we've noticed that a few times before already. Chapter 20, verse 3 and 20, verse 7 are almost identical. They basically repeat each other, which clearly indicates that John is resuming what he said in verse 3. He's now resuming it in verse 7. Right. The fact that he resumes what was left off in 20, verse 3 is evident. That 20 verse 3 ends with the affirmation that Satan's not able to deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were finished. And then John resumes in verse 7 by saying, and when the 1,000 years were finished. So clearly that seems what's going on. That means now, so let's talk about verses 4 through 6. It's this interruption in the discussion of Satan being bound for 1,000 years. Here we go. John also links the account of the victorious martyrs. And that's the fill in the blank. You can write the martyrs, the souls of God's people, or the victor, but they're victorious. I saw the throes of those who have overcome. Let me turn 20. I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been victorious, who have been beheaded on account of the testimony of Jesus and the word of God. And they did not worship the beast nor his image, and they did not receive his mark on their forehead or on their right hand. And they came to life, and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. That's verse 4. Okay, so the victorious martyrs. He links the account of the victorious martyrs with the account of the binding and releasing of Satan. So the next fill in the blank is binding and releasing of Satan. Okay, so what happened? What I'm talking about now is this: verses 1, 2, and 3 talk about the binding of Satan. Verses 4, 5, and 6 talk about the victorious martyrs. And he links those passages together, and we looked at this a couple times now over the last several weeks, because he repeats the word 1,000 in verses 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The word 1,000 occurs in every single one of them. And guess what? Those are the only 6 times the word 1,000 occurs when it's applied to a number of years. You have the word 1,000 occurring to like the 144,000. You have the word 1,000 used when you have like the number of the armies was 2 10,000s. Even though technically that's actually not 1,000, it's the word 10,000. But you never had the word 1,000 being used with a number of years. There's 1,260 days, but the only time the word 1,000 occurs with years are in these 6 verses. And those verses 2 and 3 are the first part about Satan being bound. Verses 4, 5, and 6 are about the souls of the victorious martyrs. And verse 7 is where we resume the thought about Satan being released. So all 3 of those parts are all linked together by the use of the word 1,000. So here we go. I'm going to give you what I think is the answer, and we can discuss as we proceed, unless you're so lost. It's okay. All right. It is my suggestion that the binding of Satan represents a present reality. I think John's readers already knew about this. They understood it. John's interruption of the account of the binding of Satan, in order to provide a description of the victorious people of God, quote, those who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and those who did not receive the mark upon their forehead or upon their right hand, only makes sense. And I say only, but you could argue it makes sense other ways too, but I think it makes the best sense if the suffering of the people of God corresponds to the present activity of Satan. If it doesn't, then why are you telling us about the victorious martyrs in the middle of Satan being bound? Now, some are going to say, well, wait a minute. If Satan's being bound, then how can God's people be suffering? Satan's being bound means they're not suffering anymore. And that's what I'm going to answer next. Satan's being bound doesn't mean God's people aren't suffering. It means he's only being bound so that he cannot deceive the nations any longer. That's specifically what it says. It doesn't say he's completely bound and unable to do anything. And here, let me argue that now. Here we go. So the next statement says this: I suppose that many might respond by contending that the binding of Satan indicates that he's not active, or he's inactive. He's not active during the time in which he's bound. And I'm going to question, however, if that's what the binding of Satan means. Now, it makes total sense, by the way. It makes total sense to say he's in the abyss and he can't do anything. That makes sense. I'm not denying that. I'm just arguing, I don't think that's what John's readers, and that's what John thought it meant, even though it makes sense to us on first reading. And so here's my argument. So remember last week when we went to Mark chapter 3? And let's turn there. Mark chapter 3, if somebody wants to read verse 27. Mark 3, verse 27. And the binding of Satan in Mark 3. Oops, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, it is verse 27. Yep, Mark 3, verse 27.
I can.
Thank you.
But no one can enter the strong man's house and plunder his property unless he first ties up the strong man, and then he will plunder his house.
All right. So Jesus specifically says he's bound Satan. I mean, the idea of binding only occurs in 2 places in the New Testament in this context. The binding of Satan only occurs in 2 places. In Mark 3 and Revelation 20. Now, you can't argue that they're connected the same way, but it's a good argument, even though I can't defend it because it's not the same author, right? But nonetheless, so in Mark 3:27, the bullet point says this: Jesus indicates that he's carrying out his work because he's first bound the strong man. That's the fill in the blank. He's bound the strong man, which most assuredly refers to Satan. Okay, so the argument I'm making is that Satan's being bound doesn't mean he can't do anything. It means he's limited, but it doesn't mean he's able to do nothing at all. And here's my argument. In Mark 3:27, Satan's bound. The next bullet point says this: however, Satan remained actively opposed to the work of Jesus, even though Jesus had already bound him. And that's evident because in the very next chapter, Mark tells us the parable of the sower, Mark 4. And in this sower, Jesus says, the seed which fell on the roadside, that's the fill in the blank. The seed that fell on the roadside represents those who hear the word of God and immediately, the fill in the blank is the seed that fell on the roadside. And it represents those who, when they hear the word of God, immediately Satan comes and takes away the word which is sown in them. So in Mark 4, Jesus says Satan's still active. And I think he's talking about the Pharisees, by the way. You religious leaders, the reason why you can't hear anything I have to say is because you're the seed that was sown in you represent the roadside, and the seed that I'm sowing is on the roadside, and Satan snatches it away. But how can Satan snatch it away if he was just bound? Now, that's not an absolute, because you could argue that Mark 3 and Mark 4 aren't chronological. Okay, that's fine. But here we go. The next bullet point says this: in addition, Satan's continued active resistance to the work of Jesus is evident from Jesus' rebuke to Peter in Mark 8:33, and Peter's the fill in the blank. Peter is, where he says, "Get behind me, Satan." So Jesus clearly indicates Satan is the author of your thought, Peter. I don't think he's saying that Peter was possessed by Satan, by the way. I think he's saying Satan has influenced your mind and influenced your heart. That's where it came from. Get behind me, Satan. Okay, and we can go on. The Gospels of the next bullet point says this: the Gospels of Luke and John also note Satan's continued opposition to Jesus when they say that Satan entered Judas, Luke 22, verse 3, and similarly in John 13, verse 27. And it's clear from the Gospels that Satan can be bound and yet active. The reason why Jesus was able to cast out demons is because he bound the devil. Well, when you get to the Last Supper, now chronology is clearly in play, because Satan possessing Judas happens at the Last Supper. So Jesus has been casting out demons for 3.5 years, right? Whatever that time frame may be. And now Satan's still active because he's influencing Judas. And that's where the thought for Judas, actually Satan, he didn't just influence Judas, he possessed Judas. So I think that's the clue. Now, are we ready to go on? We'll go to the last couple paragraphs and finish up. Actually, I got more than a couple paragraphs. Here we go. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Please, of course.
So going back to Mark 3:27,
Mm-hmm.
The way I'm reading it, I feel there's like a reciprocity here.
Okay.
In that, so on the one hand, it looks like Jesus is fighting for people's souls by binding the strong man and then plundering his house. So it's like, I bind you, then I'm going to try and save those that have been deceived. This is the way I'm reading it. And
Yeah, I think that's fair enough so far. Sure. Yeah.
But then also in the other examples that you're describing, where Satan plunders Jesus's house by, getting into the mind of Judas and Peter. So there's like, Satan can also bind us and plunder our house, right? So that's why I'm like,
I wouldn't use the word plunder, but I get the idea what you're saying.
well, that's what it
Satan's
says.
primary weapon is deception, right? So Satan can deceive us. Just say it that way. He can deceive us. He can also, of course, possess us, right? He can also, of course, deceive us so that we're tempted to follow the ways of man's kingdom. Like Peter says, Jesus, you're not going to die. Or to go after money, like Judas, of course, betrays Jesus for money. Whether or not illnesses, whether Satan's whether the devils possessing of people leads to physical illnesses or not, is a question that the gospel certainly raise, but certainly demonic possessions. So Satan can still do that. And we discussed this before, right? I remember, I think you asked a question last week on it in particular. What I think it's saying is your ability to deceive everyone is no longer, you're no longer able to deceive everyone. I'm going to bind you so that the nations in particular, and again, I think we have to be careful about literalizing this in the sense that Satan's literally bound somewhere, like as if he's a physical being that can actually be physically bound or whatever, right? He's a being of some nature that has a presence of some nature, which, okay, sure, it could be thrown into an abyss. If that's fine. I'm not opposed to that idea. But I think the idea simply is it's restricting his ability to deceive. And thus, the fact that I think everyone in this room right now, and none of us are Jewish, and yet we're followers of Jesus, is evidence of the fact that Satan's binding is effective because we're no longer deceived and able to come into the light of the gospel of the kingdom. Did that help answer your question, Helen, or your statement? I'm not sure if I was going the same way that you were.
I'm just trying to.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
And plunder his property unless he first finds a strong man, and then he will. But I think he's also making a point. Jesus is making a point that maybe the alternative, as he is faithful and strong, then he can't plunder his house because he can't be. There's something going on here that I'm like, it's more than what you're saying that I'm feeling is.
It is. I think the more that's going on here that I'm not delving too deeply into is the kingdom language, because the house that's being referred to, of course, is the kingdom, but specifically, actually, it's the temple. The phrase "destroy this house," destroy this temple. I'm trying to think of a verse where the word "house" is used for the temple, and I can't think of one off the top of my head. But of course, it is. So the temple, it's temple language, which is really inflammatory. Because he's basically saying Satan's come into the temple, that I had to go to the temple and bind the devil. Of course, house is referred to large, obviously, as Ezekiel 38, Ezekiel 40 through 47 uses house as a reference to temple, things like that.
Is he also saying that the reason he was able to do that is because he deceived you, he bound you. So he came in and deceived you, he as in the Satan.
Okay, Satan.
And he plundered your house. So, and I'm now gonna. So this is, I feel like there's this double thing going on here that I'm reading in this verse. That's
okay. All right. I'm not tracking completely with you. I'm sorry.
Hey, Rob.
Yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
In reference to a scripture for house, what about John 14:1? In my father's house, there are many rooms.
Yeah. There you go. And there you go. My father's house. Yep, absolutely. Very good. Thank you, Anthony. So, okay. All right. We'll come back to that. I guess the one caution I would say is I wouldn't use the idea that Satan's binding us. I think the word binding and loosing is used in a specific context, and it has larger meanings elsewhere also, but I wouldn't use that for what Satan does to us. It's just what Jesus does to Satan. So, all right, let's move on if we can. Okay, here we go. And I discussed this last time, and this is going to be a little bit complicated. So if that's okay. The demonic hordes in the 5th and 6th trumpets. So let's go to chapter 9. Revelation chapter 9. And just for time's sake, and we've been trying to finish this for a while, so if I can have your permission to go maybe 5 to 10 minutes long, I'm going to say 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to try to keep it to that to finish tonight. Then we'll finish this and we'll move on to the next conversation. And the rest of it's script that you can read for yourselves also. Revelation chapter 9. The 5th angel sounded. This is the 5th trumpet in verse 1. I saw a star from heaven which had fallen to the earth, and the key of the bottomless pit was given to him. And I argue that parallels Revelation 20, verse 1, where there's a star or an angel that has the key to the bottomless pit. There's a little bit of a difference. In verse 2, the angel opens the bottomless pit in chapter 9, whereas in Revelation 20, he closes it. Smoke went up out of the pit. In verse 3, out of the smoke came forth locusts like scorpions of the earth, and power was given to them. Verse 4, they were not to hurt the grass of the earth or any green things, but only those who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Verse 5, they couldn't kill anyone, but torment for 5 months. The torment was like a scorpion. Right? Let's go down to verse 7. The appearance of the locust was like horses prepared for battle. That's actually the word war. That's the Greek word for war. And on their heads appeared to be crowns like gold. verse 9. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron. The sound of the wings was like the sound of chariots, of horses rushing into battle. That's the other occurrence of the word war. Same word, war or battle, in the Greek text. Verse 10. They have tails like scorpions. Note the reference to tails and stings. And in their tails is the power to hurt men for 5 months. Okay, so clearly these are demonic beings. They have king over them in verse 11. The angel of the abyss, well, obviously it's the demonic being, right? Whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, which means destruction or destroyer. And in Greek, it's the name Apollyon, right? Destroyer. These are clearly demonic beings. So here's the first thing I want you to know, and that's this. All right, let's look at the next trumpet, and then we'll look at the notes. All right, the sixth trumpet sounded, the sixth angel in verse 13 sounded. And I heard a voice saying, release the four, verse 14. I heard a voice saying, release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. There's the word Euphrates is very important. There are 4 angels who have been prepared for this hour and day and month and year. They were released so they could kill 1/3 of mankind. The number of the armies of the horsemen, notice again, armies, was 2 10,000s times 10,000s. Don't look at your translations because they're all wrong when they say 200 million. We discussed that before. I heard the number of them. Verse 17, this is how I saw in the vision the horses and those who sat upon them. The riders had the breastplates the color of fire and hyacinth and brimstone. And the head of the horses, like the head of lions, out of their mouths, and the word mouths is very important, proceed fire and smoke and brimstone. 1/3 of mankind, verse 18, was killed by these 3 plagues, by the fire, the smoke, and the brimstone, which proceeded out of their mouths. Verse 19, the power of the horses in their mouths and in their tails. For their tails are like serpents and have heads. Obviously, that's the connection with Satan or the dragon. The dragon is a serpent. And with them, they do harm. Okay, so now let's go to the notes with that in our mind. Okay, here we go. Notice, so I'm looking at 19 verses 1 through 9, I'm sorry, chapter 9 verses 1 through 19, and the judgment of Satan. Let's compare those 2 passages that we just read with the judgment of Satan. Notice that both begin with the descent of a heavenly being who has a key to the abyss. And the fill in the blank is a key to the abyss. They both have a key to the abyss. The fact that John uses the word key only 4 times, and the first 2 are reference to Jesus having the keys of death and Hades. And he promises the church in Philadelphia, I have the keys, don't worry. And then the last 2 times are 9:1 and 21, seemingly, but you can't argue for sure, links these 2 passages. John's first 2 uses of key both refer to Christ as the one who has the key of David and the key of death and Hades. And the second one, he has the key of David, chapter 3, verse 8. The last 2 are linked with one another and serve, if anything, as a contrast to the key of the heavenly beings in 9:1 and 20 verse 1. Okay, let's go to the next bullet point. In addition, the account of the demonic hordes in the 5th and 6th trumpets are clearly linked with the 3 accounts of the war. Remember chapter 16, verses 12 through 14, 12 through 16, 19, 17 through 21, and 27 through 20, the war. And we have a reference to war. The next bullet point says this: the term war appears 9 times in the book of Revelation. 7, and the next bullet point, the last 7 occurrences of war depict the war that's waged by the dragon or his minions against Christ, again, or Michael and his angels, and or against the people of God. So the next bullet point basically says, I think the word war links also with the war of Armageddon. I'm just going to skip over that one because that's the argument I'm making there. Okay, the next paragraph says this: this conclusion gains credibility from the far more apparent links, and the word links is the key, is the fill in the blank, with the 6th trumpet and the famed war of Armageddon in the 6th bowl. Okay, so the word links is the fill in the blank. And here's the bullet point. The demonic beings in the account of the 6th trumpet are prepared in order that they might kill 1/3 of mankind. That's linked with the war of Armageddon. And the reason why it's linked is because they both reference the great river Euphrates. In 16:12 through 16 and in 9:14, they both refer to the word Euphrates. Guess what? The word Euphrates occurs only twice in the entire book of Revelation. Once in the account of the 6th trumpet, chapter 9, verse 14, and once in the Armageddon passage, chapter 16, verse 12. Clearly, John links the 6th trumpet and the Armageddon passage. The 6th trumpet are demonic beings that are released so they can kill 1/3 of mankind. And guess what? They crossed the Euphrates, and the Euphrates is referred to in the Armageddon passage. Okay, I'm going to skip down to the next bullet point. In addition, the account of the sixth trumpet, John states that the demonic horde, their power was in their mouths and in their tails, chapter 9, verse 19. That's why I remember I pointed out the word mouths and tails. This provides another strong link with the sixth bowl. The sixth bowl is the Armageddon passage. This is another link with the sixth bowl, where the demonic frog-like beings come out of the mouth of the dragon. The fill in the blank is mouth. And the three fill in the blanks are the word mouth all three times. The mouth of the dragon, the mouth of the beast, and the mouth of the false prophet. So they're linked by the use of the word mouth also. In addition, all right, next paragraph. In addition, there are also clear links with the demonic horde in the accounts of the fifth and sixth trumpets and the description of the final judgment of Satan. All right, and then tabbing in the bullet point there says John is seemingly unnecessary reiteration. The dragon is the ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan. In chapter 20, verse 2, it says, then the dragon, who is the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. You're like, why are you telling us who the dragon is? We know who the dragon is. The repetition in chapter 20, verse 2 about who the dragon is, that he's the devil and Satan, ancient serpent, we're like, we know who he is. Well, guess what? The demonic horde and the sixth trumpet have tails that are like serpents. The repetition of the word serpent in 20, verse 2 and 19, chapter 9, verse 19 links the two passages. This link gains further strength from the fact that the word serpent occurs 5 times. And guess what? Every one of those times it refers to Satan. Well, 4 of the 5 times it refers to Satan. The only exception is chapter 9, which links the demonic horde in chapter 9 with the dragon, who is Satan. So the fact that 3 of the uses of the word serpent occurred in the account of the woman, I'm getting really deep now. So if I lose you here, don't worry, we'll move forward. The fact that 3 of the uses of the word serpent occur in the dragon and the woman episode, chapter 12, verses 1 through 17, which serve to introduce the dragon, further strengthens the link with the other two uses, because 9, 19, and 20, verse 2 are the only 2 occurrences of the word serpent outside of the dragon and the woman passage. And so it seems to argue as the link. All right, here we go, moving on. In particular, all right, the differences with the accounts. Well, the differences are this. The heavenly being with the key of the abyss in the account of the fifth trumpet is said to have fallen, which some people think it makes him a demon, which it may, but it may not. Whereas in the present account, chapter 20, verse 1, it was an angel coming down out of heaven. And my argument is this may or may not be the same being, and you can't argue either way, yes or no. The fact that they both have a key and they're both coming to the abyss, I think links the 2 passages. So that's kind of what I would say there. All right, so you can skip that paragraph. In addition, some going to argue that we should not read, these passages should not be read in light of one another. Because in chapter 9, verse 2, the angel opens the abyss, and in 20, verse 3, he shuts it. And this is where I think the insider language comes in. This is my theory as to what's going on. I think John's readers already knew Satan was bound because the Gospel of Mark told them so. So what chapter 20, verses 1 through 10 do is this, okay? And I'm not reading the notes right now. I'm just kind of summarizing. Remember, chapter 20, verses 1 through 10 was to say Satan is captured and thrown in the lake of fire. But it starts by saying, well, he's bound for 1,000 years. I think that bounding of 1,000 years is going back to filling in the story of Satan in the Gospel of Mark. And oh, guess what? Those who were beheaded, you guys are resurrected, and you're going to reign with Christ for the 1,000 years while Satan's being bound. Now, guess what happens? At the end of the 1,000 years, that pit's going to be opened. And I think that's what chapter 9 is describing. So chapter 20 is describing what happened in the Gospel of Mark, verses 1, 2, and 3. Satan's bound for 1,000 years, and you know it. And I think that's the insider language. And I'm totally filling in the blanks, and I could be wrong. But I think he's going back telling you the story. And John does this, by the way, in chapter 12. He goes back and tells you about the dragon standing before the woman who was about to give birth to a child. He went back in time. John goes back in time on a couple instances, and this is one of them. In chapter 9, the pit's opened. And it's open for how long? 5 months. Remember, Satan will be released for a little while. And that little while apparently is, well, I don't think we take the time frame literally. So let me read the notes. All right. The opening and closing of the abyss suggest movement within the story. We may account for the opening and closing of the abyss in one of two ways. So two ways you can do it. First, you can argue the abyss is open in chapter 9, and then Satan thrown in chapter 20 and it's closed. That would be a premillennial viewpoint. It was open and now it's closed. And Satan's in it for 1,000 years, then he's released, and Jesus rules on the earth for 1,000 years. Or you could argue the accounts are not chronological. That is, as far as the narrative is concerned, the throwing of Satan into the abyss takes place prior to the release of the demonic horde in chapter 9. That the second option is favored gains support from an understanding of the structure of the judgment of the account of the judgment of Satan. And that's what I spend the rest of the time on. So I think there's no more fill in the blanks. So I think that maybe, is there a fill in the blank at the very bottom? Yes or no?
No.
No? Okay, thanks, John. Okay. I'm just gonna look at, okay, good. I have it bold in my notes, but I'm not sure. Okay, here, let me go down to the very bottom. Very bottom. Okay, so there's some italics. And underneath the italics, it says, at the same time as I noted above. Everybody see that? Third paragraph from the end. The binding of Satan does not mean he's unable to do anything. And we already discussed that. The next paragraph says this. John's insertion of the victorious people of God in the middle of the account of the judgment of Satan serves to encourage the reader or hearers to persevere in light of the glorious outcome that awaits them. That's the key. Whether this is happening now or whether this is happening after Jesus returns, guess what? When we get to the New Jerusalem, I'm going to go, I told you so. Or you're going to go, I told you so. And neither one of us is going to care. Right? Because if Jesus comes down from heaven and establishes a 1,000-year reign on the earth, we're going to be like, oh, cool. Rob was wrong. And if Jesus comes down from heaven and ushers us into the New Jerusalem, you're going to go, oh, Rob was right. Either way, it doesn't matter. What matters is how we live now. And my argument is this. If you are a premillennialist, that's totally fine. I was for most of my life, right? If you don't know, I have a master's degree from Liberty University. You don't get more pre-tribulational, premillennial, and all that good stuff than Liberty. Okay. So that's the way I was raised, and I was trained even through graduate school. No problem at all. The only thing I would say would be, you still need to have a strong emphasis on the now part of the kingdom. And you can agree with me, even if you think the kingdom is also future. The presence of the now part of the kingdom is Jesus is Lord. He rose from the dead and already established his kingdom. And what that means also is this, and he gave us the Spirit of God. And because of the Spirit of God in us, we already are a new creation. Whether that means there's going to be a millennium or not, doesn't matter. And we need to live as kings and queens and priests of God in the now.
Amen.
Doing what? Building his kingdom. Whether it's a prelude to the millennial kingdom or whether it's a prelude to the New Jerusalem, it doesn't matter. We're building the kingdom. See, it doesn't matter. So that's kind of the way I say. All right. Then the last paragraph says, even if they are killed by the dragon. So we're supposed to persevere, even if they're killed by the dragon. Or shall we say the beast, who is the one who does the dragon's bidding and kills the two witnesses. They are the ones who came to life and reign with Christ. Whether they reign with Christ in the now or whether they reign with Christ in the future, it doesn't matter. So that's the long and short of it. So that's really technical. So if I lost you, it's okay, because I think you got the gist of the book even still. What we'll do next time is we'll do 20 verses 11 through 15, 21:8. We'll kind of intro that, and then we are in the New Jerusalem, and it doesn't get better than that. And guess what? It is awesome. It is an incredible passage because it describes us like Jesus. It describes Jesus with us. It describes us dwelling in God's eternal presence, and discusses us as doing that in Eden languages. The entire biblical story comes to a climax in this new creation passage. It's not actually a city, even though it says it is. It's Eden, restored and redeemed. I like to say Eden redeemed, because it's not just Eden restored, because it's not the old Eden. Because in the old Eden, we could choose wrong, and there is no, it's Eden redeemed. And then there's the glorious end of the text also. And then we'll go back and say for a few weeks, like, okay, what does the beast mean today? What's the heart of Babylon mean today? And we're going to ask some of those questions. I'm going to try to write some blogs on that, which may come out before we get there. So if you read my blogs, you may have a head start on what we're going to discuss. But is that fair enough? Any questions or comments? I said 5 or 10 minutes. I was 9 minutes. Not bad. All right. Any questions or
Yeah,
comments?
I love how you said just a few minutes ago that you're getting ready to get deep. I'm glad we only got deep a few minutes ago.
Yeah, it's only been the last few minutes. If you thought we got deep beforehand, it's not my fault. That's on you. Yeah, no.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't.
no,
have
I
a
said we
long
were getting
enough-
deep from the
yeah.
start, John. I said it from the start. I said if we wade in the quagmire or whatever word, the muddy waters, it's gonna get really deep. I said that at the beginning.
My
So-
snorkel wasn't long enough.
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, really. So, all right.
Good
Any
stuff.
questions?
Very good.
All right, good. Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to turn off Facebook. Thanks to you guys on Facebook. So Facebook, just be aware, we will not meet for the next 4 weeks. So if you've been watching us live, our next meeting will be the second week of August. I think that's going to be August 9th, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's Wednesday, August 9th. That'll be our next meeting. And those of you guys obviously watching the YouTube channel, just stay tuned to the YouTube channel. And good. All right.
So Rob, I do